So, first of all, I'm all ears listening to the concerns that Holly Cairns has raised, and they're very detailed, and I'll be looking forward to your response to them. On the way in here, I'm sure most of you would have noticed that Sheila is yet again outside with her display on the question of mother and baby homes and the suffering that it has went on. And within that, she mentions the 9,000 children who are alleged to have died across 18 homes. Sean Ross has mentioned Bessborough, Castlepollard, Dunboyne and more. And it just reminded me, about a year ago I think it was, I watched a very interesting documentary on Al Jazeera where they showed you aerial archaeology of Castlepollard and the graves around it, what they suspect are graves around it. And I think that whatever comes out of all of this and the legislation and the complications around it, it can't just stop at Tuam. But I do want to start by acknowledging that you have listened to the campaigners and the relatives around the Tuam case, and that Catherine Corliss has said that you've taken on board issues that she and campaigners had with the original draft of the bill, and I welcome that, specifically issues around the disapplication of the Coroners Act to those sites. And to listen and involve relatives in the process of the exhumation of remains and the identification of those remains has been hugely important. However, I also want to raise just a couple of issues quickly that were brought to my attention today from Sally's Separation, Appropriation and Loss Initiative, and they have concerns around the bill. They say that you have retained a highly controversial provision that empowers ministers to unilaterally decide if a site is to be exhumed and investigated or subject to a process of memorialisation. It also says the proposal of an advisory panel is unambitious and severely limits the input and guidance for so many survivors and their representative groups. So I think that notwithstanding these concerns, it's important to acknowledge that the bill is a much changed bill from the original one that we saw, and that legislation that continues to ignore the wishes and views of those directly involved in this terrible travesty of our history cannot proceed, and that it is very good that you've listened to survivors and their campaigners in this. But I hope it also shows that where there's a political will to respond to witnesses and those affected, we can also bring it into other aspects of legislation around the mother and baby homes and the legacy. So, because having acknowledged that in relation to this specific bill, there are serious questions on the wider issues connected with Tuam, other sites, the loss of all these children and their mothers and what happened to them. And the first issue I just want to mention to you is the redress scheme itself. The attempt to place a time limit on it to those who can access it. The idea that those with less than 6 months spent in mother and baby homes cannot access it. I have to say that you should listen to campaigners on this issue also, like you have done on the specifics of this bill. It is certain that trauma and lifelong effects follow all those who have been less than 6 months in these homes, and to choose that is an arbitrary and unscientific limit without any justification, either morally, ethically or legally. And the second issue is the predicated costs of the redress scheme. A redress scheme, according to a report, including all 58,000 survivors of mother and baby homes, would cost 1.6 billion. Civil servants have alleged to have warned the government and could derail attempts to support the survivors most in need. But let's be clear about this, and I really want to emphasise this. Many of the institutions and orders that ran these homes have enormous assets and land. Others have built medical and hospital facilities, empires really, on the graves of those infants. And again, if we have the political will, we can and should seize the assets of those orders and whatever remains of the legal entities that they have evolved into. We can't repeat the disaster of the Woods deal, where a subservient state and political class allowed the church and its institutions to put a figure on what they agreed to donate for the torture and abuse of children in this state over the decades to a redress scheme. They were allowed to manipulate and drag their heels for years and are still allowed to do so. And lastly, I want to comment again and urge the Minister to show the political will to deal with the gaping wound that the Commission's report has inflicted on the people affected by this entire episode in our history. and be clear that the findings of the Commission report are not acceptable to many, many victims and survivors, full stop. Not even at a political level by TDs and senators, but by the people who are mostly affected. Several witnesses who testified at the Commission found that excerpts from their evidence was taken out of the report. It contained inaccuracies, misrepresentations, etc. We all know how seriously damaging it was. In stark contrast to those reports, we know that 9,000 children died in the homes under investigation, and it is said that we found little evidence on issues such as forced adoptions, abuse and involuntary detention. Survivors have told us that the Commission's findings ignored flatly and contradicted their personal testimony. That cannot be allowed to stand. Moreover, Minister, it is not acceptable that a state-conducted commission should leave on the record the findings that institutions and religious orders were no more culpable for the torture and deaths in these homes than was general society. The attempt to lessen the responsibility of those directly responsible by referencing societal views is and remains the most egregious aspect of the report, and it is one that we need to see a political will in this House to address and correct. The attempt to absolve the sins of religious orders by blaming us all is further abuse of those victims. And I finish by asking you to show the same political will in addressing those issues as you have done in the extent that you've addressed the Tuam issue in the details of this bill. And thank you.